She walked into the courtroom with a bright smile, as if she still had a great deal of hope, when her attorney requested a bond hearing. She seemed to believe that her calm appearance would help convince people that she was innocent. This former dancer had convinced herself that the jury would believe her defense. She had built a story that sounded believable, a story filled with emotion, a story about a wife who had suffered through a painful and abusive marriage for a long time. Her attorneys and supporters insisted that she was the victim of serious domestic abuse and that she had acted only in self-defense. They argued that she never intended to take her husband's life. At first, those arguments seemed reasonable. The jury listened to them and considered the defense carefully. But when prosecutors began connecting multiple layers of evidence, the entire picture changed. What you are about to see is the moment Ashley Benefield realized that planning to kill her husband in order to gain custody was not the same as self-defense. This became a disturbing and deeply contested case about whether the shooting was intentional or whether it was truly an act of self-defense. And every detail you are about to witness has been verified through court records, trial testimony, and the forensic conclusions presented in court. If you have never heard this story before, prepare yourself, because what happened in Lakewood Ranch, Manatee County, Florida, on the 27th of September, 2020, will challenge everything you thought you knew about deception, hidden truths, the line between self-defense and an intentional act. Before the courtroom and the headlines, Ashley Benefield was known as Ashley Byers, a former ballet dancer whose life had been shaped by performance, discipline, and the stage. Ballet was not only part of her background, it became part of the public identity attached to this case. Because of that connection, the media later referred to the proceedings as the Black Swan Murder Case, even though that phrase was only a media label, not the official legal name. Douglas Benefield, known as Doug, was Ashley's husband. He was about 30 years older than she was. Before meeting Ashley, Doug had served in the United States Navy and had already built a separate life, career, and family. He was a widower and had an adult daughter from his earlier marriage. When Ashley and Doug met in 2016, their relationship moved quickly. They married after knowing each other for less than 2 weeks. At the time, Ashley was about 24, while Doug was about 54. After the wedding, the couple became involved in an ambitious ballet project called the American National Ballet. On paper, it appeared to combine Ashley's world of dance with Doug's resources, support, and business experience. But the company soon fell into crisis and collapsed. That failure was not only professional. It placed more pressure on a marriage that had already moved at unusual speed and carried a large age gap. As time passed, the relationship between Ashley and Doug became increasingly strained. Allegations of control, mistreatment, family conflict, and instability began to surround the marriage. What had once been presented as a shared dream in the ballet world became a relationship marked by competing claims and growing mistrust. Ashley and Doug also had a daughter together. When the marriage broke down, custody became one of the central points of conflict. Ashley said she feared Doug and believed she had been controlled and mistreated. Prosecutors later argued that Ashley exaggerated or created some of those claims to gain an advantage in the custody dispute. That conflict became the central question of the case. Was Ashley a frightened woman who believed she was protecting herself, or was she using a story of fear to hide another motive? To understand the case, that tension must be understood first. In 2016, Ashley Benefield and Douglas "Doug" Benefield met, and their relationship moved very quickly. Within a short period of time, they were married. The age gap between them was significant, and they were also at very different stages of life. Ashley was a young former ballet dancer, still tied to performance, ambition, and the possibility of building a future in the arts. Doug was much older, with an established past, an adult daughter from a previous marriage, and more life experience behind him. From the beginning, the relationship contained factors that could easily create imbalance. Psychologically, a marriage that forms this quickly often does not give either person enough time to understand the other deeply. Questions about money, family expectations, emotional needs, decision-making, conflict, and personal boundaries may not be fully examined before the relationship becomes legally and emotionally serious. In this case, that rapid beginning later became part of a much larger picture. What started as a fast and intense connection eventually became a relationship marked by pressure, disappointment, and competing versions of what had really been happening behind closed doors. In 2017, Ashley and Doug founded the American National Ballet. At first, the project appeared to bring together Ashley's artistic dream and Doug's financial and organizational support. For Ashley, Ballet was more than a profession or a past interest. It was tied to identity, discipline, public image, and ambition. For Doug, the company represented investment, responsibility, and a shared vision with his new wife. On the surface, it looked like the kind of project that could unite them, but the American National Ballet quickly fell into disorder and closed after a short time. The failure of that company was not only a professional setback, it placed additional weight on a marriage that was already unusual in its speed and structure. When a shared dream collapses, the emotional effects can be deep. It can create blame, resentment, disappointment, and a sense that one person was misled or failed by the other. In this case, the collapse of the ballet company became one of the early signs that the marriage was moving from high expectations into conflict. By 2018, Ashley had given birth to the couple's daughter. After the child was born, the conflict between Ashley and Doug deepened. Ashley began making allegations that Doug was controlling, abusive, and dangerous. She also sought legal protection at different points. However, Doug was not criminally prosecuted over those allegations. That gap became one of the most important areas of disagreement in the case. When a marriage breaks down and a child is involved, the conflict often becomes more complicated than a simple separation. The issue is no longer only whether two adults can stay together. It becomes about custody, visitation, where the child will live, who will make decisions, and whether either parent is safe. In this case, both sides later used the family history to explain what happened. Ashley said she feared Doug and was trying to protect herself and her child. Prosecutors argued that Ashley wanted to remove Doug from their daughter's life and used the abuse allegations as part of that effort. Between 2018 and 2020, two completely different narratives began to form. Ashley continued to say that Doug controlled her, mistreated her, and made her fear for her safety. Her defense attorneys would later use those allegations to present her as a woman who felt threatened for a long time and finally reacted in fear. They wanted the jury to understand the shooting not as an isolated moment, but as the end point of a relationship that Ashley believed had become dangerous. Prosecutors saw the same history in a very different way. They argued that Ashley had built a record of accusations in order to gain an advantage in the custody dispute. In their view, the case was not about a woman who had no other option. It was about a woman who wanted control over her future as a mother and wanted Doug removed from that future. This was the central conflict of the case: self-defense versus custody motive. That is why the psychological layer of this case is difficult. It cannot be viewed only as a domestic shooting, and it cannot be understood only through emotion. The defense needed the jury to believe that Ashley's fear was real. The prosecution needed the jury to focus on the physical evidence and conclude that the scene did not match Ashley's version of lawful self-defense. The truth of the case, legally, depended on whether her fear was connected to an immediate danger at the moment she fired. On the 27th of September, 2020, Doug went to the home of Ashley's mother in Lakewood Ranch, Manatee County, Florida. The two were involved in moving belongings. Ashley's mother took the couple's young daughter outside, leaving Ashley and Doug inside the home. After that, an argument took place. Ashley then fired at Doug. He was seriously injured and later died at the hospital. At that point, the central question was not who fired. Ashley did not deny that she was the one who shot Doug. The central question was why she did it. Ashley said Doug attacked her and that she feared for her life. She described the shooting as a defensive act in a moment of danger. Prosecutors argued that the physical evidence did not support the claim that Doug was creating an immediate threat when she fired. They focused on the condition of the scene, the wounds, and the fact that Doug was not armed. After the shooting, Ashley left the home and went to a neighbor. A 911 call was made.
Board in line, this is Gabby. How can I help you?
Hey, Gabby, it's Karen. On 11327, I have John Singer on the phone. He's saying the neighbor came over, female neighbor. It was a domestic. She shot her husband.
Okay. All right, I'm going to get that on the screen, okay?
Okay.
Which screen is this her at?
The 11327 White Rock Terrace.
Okay.
That's my address.
That's your address? What's her address? Where this occurred at?
Her address is right next to, I believe it's 11331.
She's on the corner?
Okay.
Yes, ma'am, on the corner. She's with me now, quite upset. The weapon is here. We need the police before her mother and the little girl gets back from the park. I don't want them to find this.
Yeah.
You want me to go over and look at anything or just wait for the police?
No, I want you to just wait for the police, okay?
All right, if you could just get them here quick.
Gabby, you want to let us know if we need EMS?
Yes, we will.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so they were in an argument?
I don't know. She came in. She was quite hysterical. I didn't know who was banging on my door. Said that he attacked her, and she shot him. They've been having trouble.
Okay. I'm just getting that all on the screen, okay?
Okay. I know, honey. Come on, calm down. I know.
Okay,
It's not what people think. It's not what people think it is. I know.
Yeah.
Go ahead, ma'am.
Where is the gun? Is it with her, or is it just...
I have it right here, ma'am. It's sitting on the floor inside the door. My door's locked, so in case he isn't, he can't get up. I'm also armed if he does come over and try to harm her, just so everybody knows.
Okay.
I'm kind of concerned with her mother and the little girl might get back there and find this, whatever happened.
The deputies are running as fast as they can, okay?
Okay. Don't go out there, honey. Come on. I know. I know. I've seen it before. It's no different in combat. Come on, honey. Sit down. Sit down. I know.
Yeah. All right, I just want you guys to stay on the phone with me, okay?
Yeah, I'm right here with you. I'm just with her. I'm trying to comfort her, explaining it isn't what people think it is when it happens.
Yeah. I'm sure she's pretty shaken up as well, okay?
I hope so. I've been worried about them for so long.
Okay. Have they been having issues recently?
Beg your pardon?
They've been having issues recently?
I'm not too sure how long. I'm not sure. Where in the house is he? Oh, the police are going to want to know, probably. I know, baby. You got to sit down. Come on. There's no... Well, honey, they want you to stay here. If he isn't, we can't take a chance. That's why I want them to hurry up before you get back from the park.
Deputies are moving as fast as they can. They're coming priority. They're coming lights and sirens. They just want to get and make sure that everything's okay. So where in the house is he?
Where in the house is he?
My bedroom.
Her bedroom. No, I don't know where that is. So it's one of the bedrooms. It's a lot like mine, so I'm going to assume when you go into is the garage door open? When you go in through the garage, it's going to be on the left? Yeah. On the left.
Okay.
When authorities arrived, Doug was seriously wounded and was later taken for emergency care, but he did not survive. This action after the shooting could be interpreted in two different ways. The defense could argue that Ashley ran to a neighbor because she was frightened and needed help. Prosecutors could argue that what mattered most was not where she went afterward, but whether the evidence inside the house supported her account of self-defense. The investigation focused on several categories of evidence. Investigators examined the scene inside the home of Ashley Benefield's mother, the direction of the shots, the number of shots fired, the location of Doug Benefield's wounds, whether Doug had a weapon, Ashley's statements, the family court history, and the earlier allegations of abuse between the couple. For prosecutors, the physical evidence became central. They argued that Doug was not armed and that the scene did not fully support Ashley's claim that she had only reacted to an immediate threat. Reports from the trial noted that prosecutors focused on the placement of Doug's wounds and the condition of the room to challenge the self-defense narrative. In their view, the evidence raised serious questions about whether Ashley's actions were necessary in that moment. The defense approached the case from a different direction. Instead of focusing only on the seconds when the shots were fired, they asked the jury to look at the history of the relationship. Ashley's attorneys said Doug had controlled, manipulated, and mistreated her. They argued that Ashley's fear did not appear suddenly on the day of the shooting, but had built over time. Ashley also took the witness stand and testified that she feared for her life. This made the case especially difficult. The physical evidence and the psychological background pointed the jury toward two different ways of understanding the same event. The defense wanted the jury to see the shooting through the full history of the relationship and the fear Ashley said she carried. Prosecutors wanted the jury to focus on the final moment itself, whether Doug was creating an immediate danger, whether Ashley's response matched that danger, and whether the forensic details supported her account. That conflict is what made the case so debated. It was not only about what Ashley said she felt. It was about whether the scene, the wounds, the absence of a weapon, and the larger custody dispute supported the legal requirements of self-defense. Ashley Benefield was identified from the beginning because she was the person who fired the shots, and she did not deny that fact. This was not a case where investigators had to search for an unknown suspect or reconstruct who had been inside the home. The central issue was different. Investigators had to determine the legal meaning of what happened, whether the shooting was self-defense, manslaughter, or murder. After reviewing the scene, Ashley's statement, the physical evidence, and the history between Ashley and Doug Benefield, prosecutors charged her with second-degree murder on November 4, 2020. From that point forward, the case moved into years of legal proceedings. Those proceedings included arguments about self-defense, Florida's Stand Your Ground law, psychological evidence, prior allegations of abuse, and records connected to the custody dispute. The questioning in this case was important, because Ashley's account was not a denial, it was an explanation. She said she had acted because she feared for her life. In self-defense cases, that kind of statement must be examined carefully. It is not enough for a defendant to say, "I was afraid." Investigators must determine whether that fear was connected to an immediate threat, whether the response was legally justified, and whether the physical evidence supports the account. That is why Ashley occupied two roles at the same time. She was the person who reported a self-defense narrative, but she was also the focus of the criminal investigation. The case would depend on whether the evidence supported her fear as lawful self-defense or whether it pointed to criminal responsibility. Prosecutors strengthened the case against Ashley Benefield through three main lines of argument. The first was the physical evidence. They focused on the location of Doug Benefield's wounds, the number of shots fired, the fact that Doug was not armed, and their position that the scene did not fully match a lawful self-defense explanation. For the prosecution, the question was not whether Ashley fired the weapon. She had already acknowledged that. The question was whether the physical evidence supported her claim that she had no other choice in that moment. The second line of argument was motive, connected to custody. Prosecutors argued that Ashley wanted to become a single mother and did not want Doug to have access to their daughter. People reported that the prosecution claimed Ashley wanted to remove Doug from the child's life. This argument gave the state a reason for why the shooting may have occurred beyond fear alone. It allowed prosecutors to present the case as part of a larger family conflict, not simply an isolated confrontation inside the home. The third line of argument was the prosecution's response to Ashley's abuse allegations. Prosecutors did not necessarily argue that the marriage had been peaceful or uncomplicated. Instead, they argued that Ashley's allegations did not legally justify the shooting. From their perspective, even if the relationship was troubled, that did not prove Doug created an immediate threat at the exact moment she fired. The defense saw the same facts differently. Ashley's attorneys argued that the history of alleged abuse was not a side issue. They said it was the foundation for understanding why Ashley feared Doug and why she believed she needed to protect herself. In their view, the jury could not evaluate the shooting without first understanding the relationship that led to it. This was the core tension in the case. Prosecutors had to prove that the shooting was not lawful self-defense. The defense had to show that the history of fear made Ashley's actions understandable and legally justified. The jury ultimately reached a middle ground. They did not convict her of second-degree murder, but they also did not accept complete self-defense. Instead, they found her guilty of manslaughter with a firearm, reflecting criminal responsibility without adopting the prosecution's highest charge. The trial took place in 2024 Manatee County, Florida. Ashley Benefield was tried on a charge of second-degree murder in the death of Douglas "Doug" Benefield. From the beginning, the case drew wide public attention because it involved several elements that made the courtroom narrative unusually complex. Ashley's background in ballet, the large age gap in the marriage, a disputed family history, a custody conflict, and the central question of whether the fatal incident was self-defense or a criminal act. The jury did not publicly make any separate statement about Ashley during the trial, and there is no reliable public record showing that jurors directly commented on her as a person while the proceedings were underway. What stood out was the length and meaning of their deliberation. The jury deliberated for nearly 7 hours before reaching a verdict. AP reported that jurors did not convict Ashley of second-degree murder. Instead, they found her guilty of the lesser offense of manslaughter with a firearm. That verdict was important because it showed that the jury appeared to weigh both sides carefully. They did not fully accept the prosecution's strongest theory that Ashley's actions rose to second-degree murder. At the same time, they also did not fully accept the defense argument that she should be cleared under self-defense. The result landed between the two positions. It recognized criminal responsibility, but at a lower level than the murder charge prosecutors had pursued. Ashley took the witness stand in her own defense. Her argument was that she feared Doug and believed she was in danger when she fired. She described the relationship as frightening and said her actions came from fear for her safety. In media coverage after the trial, Ashley's courtroom presence was described as emotional at certain moments, especially when she spoke about alleged abuse, fear, and the events leading up to the fatal encounter. But prosecutors challenged how the jury should interpret those emotions. Prosecutor Suzanne O'Donnell argued that Ashley's emotional display on the witness stand was not proof of the truth of her account. The prosecution suggested that Ashley was trying to persuade the jury through emotion, while the physical evidence told a different story. In that way, Ashley's expression in court became more than a human reaction. It became part of the fight over credibility. For the defense, Ashley's emotions were tied to the larger story they wanted the jury to understand. Her attorneys argued that she had been threatened, controlled, and placed in fear over time. They presented the case as the endpoint of a relationship marked by alleged abuse and instability. Their goal was to move the jury beyond the final seconds of the incident and ask them to consider the whole relationship that came before it. The defense also pointed to Ashley's attempts to seek legal protection and the history of allegations involving Doug. Some reporting noted that the defense referred to battered woman syndrome or similar psychological patterns connected to people who say they have lived in abusive relationships. The purpose of that argument was to explain why Ashley may have perceived danger in a way that could not be understood by looking only at the room, the wounds, or the last moments alone. Prosecutors took the opposite approach. They wanted the jury to focus closely on the physical evidence and the legal requirements of self-defense. Their position was that a difficult marriage, prior allegations, or a custody dispute did not automatically justify the use of deadly force. The core legal question remained whether Doug posed an immediate threat at the moment Ashley acted, and whether her response was justified under the law. The family of Doug Benefield reacted strongly to the case and to the sentence that followed. Doug's daughter, Eva, spoke during the sentencing phase and expressed grief, anger, and the lasting pain caused by the loss of her father. For Doug's family, the case was not only a courtroom debate about self-defense, it was the loss of a father and loved one. Some reports noted that family members were relieved there was a prison sentence, but still believed Ashley had not shown genuine remorse. This emotional divide made the courtroom especially difficult. Ashley's side asked the jury to see fear. Doug's family asked the court to see loss. Prosecutors asked jurors to see accountability. The defense asked them to see survival. Each side presented a different moral frame for the same event. On the 30th of July 2024, the jury returned its verdict. Ashley Benefield was found guilty of manslaughter with a firearm, not second-degree murder. That decision became the defining legal outcome of the trial. It meant the jury rejected the highest charge, but also rejected complete justification. In the end, the verdict reflected a middle ground. Ashley was not convicted of murder, but she was still held criminally responsible for Doug Benefield's death. On the 3rd of December 2024, Ashley Benefield was sentenced to 20 years in prison, followed by 10 years of probation. Judge Matt White imposed the sentence after rejecting a motion for a new trial based on allegations of juror misconduct. AP reported the sentence and noted that Ashley's attorney planned to appeal both the conviction and the punishment. The maximum sentence for manslaughter with a firearm could have reached 30 years, but Ashley received 20 years. That sentence reflected the court's view that the offense remained serious, even though the jury did not convict her of second-degree murder. The verdict had already placed the case below murder, but it did not erase criminal responsibility. For the court, Doug Benefield's death still required a significant punishment. The sentence also marked a difficult moment for both sides. Ashley's defense continued to maintain that the case involved self-defense and fear. Doug's family viewed the prison term as accountability, though no sentence could undo the loss. Ashley Benefield is currently serving a 20-year prison sentence for manslaughter with a firearm. According to My Suncoast, Ashley's attorneys filed an appeal in 2025, and the appeal process in Florida could take 1 to 2 years to be reviewed. For now, the sentence imposed after trial remains in effect. Based on the most recent public reporting, the trial court judgment has not been overturned. The next legal step is the appeal, where the defense may continue challenging issues from the trial. Those arguments could involve the jury, rulings made by the court, or the way certain claims were handled before and after trial. This means the case is not fully over in a legal sense, even though Ashley has already been convicted and sentenced. The appeal may continue to test parts of the trial record, but unless a higher court changes the outcome, the conviction and 20-year sentence remain the controlling result. The Ashley Benefield case is complicated because it was never centered on the question of who fired the shots. Ashley admitted that she was the person who shot Douglas Benefield. The real question was whether she fired to protect herself, or whether the shooting came from a family conflict that had escalated beyond control. That distinction shaped the entire case, from the investigation to the verdict. What made the case so contested was that both sides presented powerful narratives. Ashley said she was a frightened wife who had been controlled, mistreated, and left without enough protection. She asked the jury to understand her actions through the history of the marriage and the fear she said she had carried for years. Prosecutors told a very different story. They argued that Ashley wanted control over her daughter's life, wanted Doug removed from the family picture, and used allegations of abuse to support that goal. In the end, the jury did not fully choose either version. They rejected the second-degree murder charge, which showed they were not fully persuaded by the strongest theory of the prosecution. But they also rejected complete self-defense. By finding Ashley guilty of manslaughter with a firearm, the jury reached a middle point. They held her criminally responsible, but not at the level of murder. The largest message from this case is that in cases involving domestic conflict, separation, and child custody, the legal truth cannot rest only on the emotions of one side. Fear may be real, but the law still has to examine evidence, context, relationship history, and the exact moment when force was used. A person may genuinely feel afraid, but self-defense requires more than fear alone. The danger must be immediate, and the response must be legally justified under the circumstances. At the same time, allegations of abuse must never be dismissed casually. They must be heard, documented, and investigated carefully. A person can be living in fear long before a crisis becomes public, but another person can also be accused of serious behavior, and those accusations must be tested through evidence. This is why the case remains so difficult. It forced the court and the jury to look at both the emotional history and the physical facts. The first lesson is that every allegation of abuse should be taken seriously, but also examined with care. These allegations can affect safety, custody, family court decisions, and even criminal responsibility. Ignoring them can put people at risk. Accepting them without careful review can also affect the rights and lives of everyone involved. The second lesson is that family disputes, especially when young children are involved, need structured support. Lawyers, courts, safety planning, counseling, and trusted professionals exist for a reason. When conflict is handled through direct confrontation, especially in a relationship already marked by fear, distrust, and custody pressure, the consequences can become irreversible. The final lesson is that self-defense is a strict legal concept. It is not enough for someone to say they were afraid. The law asks whether the threat was immediate, whether the response was necessary, and whether the evidence supports that account. In Ashley Benefield's case, the jury concluded that the evidence was not enough to erase criminal responsibility, but it also was not enough to convict her of murder. That is why the case remains controversial. It does not fit easily into one simple category. It is not just a story about fear, and it is not only a story about custody. It is a case about how private conflict, legal systems, physical evidence, and human emotion can collide in a single moment. And when that moment ends with a life lost, the courtroom is left to decide not only what happened, but what the law can prove.